Hi, I'm Matt Bell, and I'm here moderating a conversation between two Dzanc books authors, Kyle Miner, author of In the Devil's Territory, and Mike Czyzniejewski, author of Elephants in Our Bedroom. Both of these authors have just recently had their first books come out from Dzanc in the last year. I think we'll start by talking about the experience of publishing your first book. Kyle, if you want to start?
It's great to publish your first book. I actually got a call from Steve Gillis, who's the publisher of Dzanc. Not that, I guess about a year before the book came out, and he said that he liked one of my stories, A Day Meant to Do Less, which he read in the Gettysburg Review, and would I be interested in publishing a book? And I said, of course. I always hoped I would get a phone call like that. And then I started putting my stories together, and I realized that I had enough stories for 2 or 3 books, but that I didn't have a book. So I began to build around that story, A Day Meant to Do Less, and I wrote 3 new stories, and that's how the book came together.
And Michael,
I think I had a very similar experience with trying to put a book together, because I had a book that was, at that point, probably just the collection of all my writing put in paginated order, which isn't a book as much as it's just all your writing and all your files. So when Steve contacted me and Dan contacted me, I started putting the book together, and that was a really good experience. And of course, the book coming out is tremendous. I don't want to say a monkey off your back, but it's certainly like a relief to know that, like, when you work so hard, that it finally does pay off, and then that somebody recognizes that. And I think, in writing, I think that's probably something that you want more than anything, is somebody just saying that, like, you're onto something, let alone say you're so onto something we want to put an entire book out. Okay, so I had an equally great experience with the first book.
how long have you been working on the stories in the book?
The first story was about 9 years old in the book, but then stories that were in the book originally probably got plucked out to try to form it towards, like Kyle said, into a theme and to follow an idea. So there's a story, from 10 years ago, a story from 8 years ago, and then most of the stories were written within the last couple of years of the book, before the book's release. So it was a long time coming where I had a book project going, but I didn't really have a book until probably right up at the last minute. In fact, I think I sent a revision about 15 minutes before they sent it off to the printer. Like, I had the last revision, so I worked on it up to the last minute.
And so yours were more recent then, at least, because A Day Meant to Do Less was probably a year or 2 old at the time?
It was about 2 years old, and another story, Goodbye Hills Other Night, it had been probably 4 years since I finished it, and I started working on it 2 or 3 years before that when I still lived in Florida.
And I think that's one of the interesting things about both of them is that, you have that long path to not only the individual stories, right? Like, that one story taking like 4 years to come out and then 3 years end up in the book, in kind of similar ways. Did that make, like, selecting the books hard? Because you're dealing with, like you're both, young writers and trying to find that out of your 10 years of work, what stuff still holds together, what stuff works as a whole. Like, how did you, like you said, you get 3 books worth of stories, like, and you ended up writing 3 new ones for this book, which means you didn't use a lot of older stuff. Like, what made you leave that stuff behind?
Well, I started looking at what I had, and some of it wasn't very good. Even published stuff, you look at it. I don't know if you've had the same experience.
Oh, I definitely have. Like, when you get a story published, when that's what's happening for you, you think, well, this story's fantastic. Somebody acknowledged that in the world. But then when you start putting a book together, like, even the editor's like, not really that impressed by it. Like, oh, that was in this great magazine, and it's probably a good story for what it is, but I think in terms of a book, or maybe you're just, especially since it took me so long to put the book together, like, your voice is completely different at this point. It almost seems like a different writer wrote this. It's not going to go in, and that's fine.
And I think having read both your books, like, I feel like the voice, like, you do you use a lot of different kind of voices, a lot of different characters, but the overall thing is obviously like a strong, cohesive author's voice. And I think your book does the same thing, where very, very cohesive as a whole. It doesn't feel like there are a lot of disparate things, And so I assume that's part of the selection then, is like weeding out those places where the tone feels off for what the book is as a whole. and maybe you had to decide what the book was to do that. Like, what would you say? Like, how did you decide, like, these are the stories that are the book? Like, these are the ones that, or a theme you're going for, or maybe what that theme was?
Well, I started looking at what I had, and the stories that I cared the most about were mostly set around a group of people that I came from. People that lived in a small enclave of Southern Baptists, mostly from different places in the South, from Kentucky, from rural Georgia, North Carolina, and Alabama, and North Florida, who found themselves in this cultural milieu that South Florida is, West Palm Beach, Florida, where there's a lot of Haitians and Cubans, there's a lot of wealthy people from the Northeast, and you have this sort of group of working class fundamentalist Christians from the South, and there's a tendency to, at the same time that you're having traffic with all kinds of people who are different, to sort of want to say, well, we distinguish ourselves by our cultural rightness somehow. And I started to notice that the strongest stories were the stories that developed out of that community. And some of the people were people for whom that community was all there was ever going to be, and for some of those people, it was people for whom finding a way out of that community was a means of finding an identity. And then I started to realize that there were all these intersections of history there in that place. I mean, I had this story about a 5th grade teacher who was actually from East Berlin and grew up, prior to and during World War II, who now is sort of finding her intersection with this community, with a group of people who came of age during integration, which in South Florida was a tremendously painful time. And I guess in starting to figure all that out, I realized maybe what kind of writer I wanted to be. In the beginning, you write for literary journals and you just want to get stories published. And then all of a sudden you realize I actually have something to say, and putting the book together helped me to figure that out.
I had an interesting experience where I also found out kind of what a book was about. It wasn't anything like Kyle's, where it wasn't about a culture, or it wasn't about a geographical area. It was more about a theme. I had my book was actually called something else for a long time. Even when it was accepted, it was called something else for probably about almost a year. And then I wrote the title story, what is now the title story, Elephants in Our Bedroom. And as soon as I finished that story, it kind of hit me all at once that was what the book was about. I've always liked that. I think it's an adage or an idiom, the elephant in the corner of the room. And once I wrote that story and it came out, I kind of realized, like, wow, that's what this whole book is about, is this breakdown of communication and not talking about what's obvious or talking about what's obvious. And a lot of my stories, despite what I tell my students, take place in people's houses and the bedrooms and stuff. I always tell students, like, don't get stuck in like apartments, like, or especially the apartment where you live. But then I kind of went and wrote a book about that, even put it in the title. So, so once I figured out that like that's what the book was going to be, was about this communication gap and between the characters, plus different things that happened within their bedrooms. I kind of like shaped the book based on that like this is what it was going to be. It was people's relationships kind of falling apart because they just didn't talk about the obvious. So, and then it kind of all fell into place. Like, it was easy. And then when I had to write a story or two extra to fill the book,